Somewhere tonight, inside a storage vault at the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology in Philadelphia, there is a broken limestone monument that still has not been perfectly put back together. Its fragments are catalogued as B16676. Curators and archaeologists assembled what they could, carefully, patiently using the methods available in the 20th century. In its reconstructed state, it stands about 10 feet tall, 5 feet wide, and roughly 1 foot thick. It was carved around 4,000 years ago. It was smashed by invaders. It was buried beneath the courtyard of a ruined city, and for at least 2,000 years it lay hidden under the soil of what is now southern Iraq, until the British archaeologist Leonard Woolley unearthed it in pieces during his excavations between 1922 and 1934. This stone matters because what is carved onto it is not vague. It is not symbolic in the loose modern sense. Across its smooth limestone surface in several carefully arranged registers, it preserves one of the clearest visual statements we have for what a ziggurat was actually understood to be. Not just what later generations guessed, not what modern summaries sometimes flatten it into, but what the people who built these structures, lived beside them, served within their precincts, and passed under their shadow, believed them to be. In the upper section of the carving, a king stands before a seated god. The god wears the great horned headdress that in Sumerian iconography marks divine status. He holds the rod and ring, ancient Mesopotamian symbols of divine authority and ordered rule. He extends them outward toward the king. The king stands at a threshold. He has not fully crossed into the god's presence. He is not shown as casually occupying sacred space. He is receiving authorization. He is being commissioned. He is being entrusted with something. And behind that image is a name. Ur-Nammu, king of Ur, who ruled from around 2112 to 2095 BC. Founder of the third dynasty of Ur. Builder of the great Ziggurat, whose lower structure still stands today at Tel al-Makayyar in southern Iraq, the best preserved ziggurat in the world. And the question raised by that image is simple. If even a king, the most powerful human being in Sumerian society, had to be specifically authorized before approaching the sacred threshold of the structure he himself ordered, built then, who exactly was allowed inside? Who entered the inner rooms? Who remained outside? And why? That is the question we are following. What you are about to hear is not legend in the casual sense. It is not mythology dismissed as fantasy. It is an investigation based on actual records, clay tablets, administrative lists, legal codes, royal inscriptions, hymns, and literary compositions written by named individuals who lived nearly 4,000 years ago. Some of them writing from inside the very institutions we are talking about, and those records are surprisingly consistent. Most people were never allowed into the innermost chambers. That answer appears again and again, across centuries, across cities, across changing dynasties, and different patron gods. The details vary, but the structure of restriction does not. The pattern is too stable to ignore. Before we go any further, take a second and notice where you are right now. What room are you in? What city? What time is it where you are? If you want, you can leave it in the comments. Not because it changes the history, but because this kind of history was once spoken only in certain rooms, to certain people, at certain times. Tonight, it belongs to anyone listening. So settle in. Let the modern room around you go quiet for a moment. And let us begin where the Sumerians themselves began at the river. Before the records, before the tablets, before dynasties were listed in clay, there was a land shaped by two rivers flowing roughly side by side toward the sea. Between them stretched a wide alluvial plain, rich with black soil, renewed year after year by floodwaters that laid down fresh mineral silt. Agriculture here was not merely possible, it was abundant. The Greeks would later call this region Mesopotamia, the land between rivers. But the Sumerians who lived there, thousands of years before the Greeks gave it that name, did not think of themselves as living between rivers. They called the southern part of their world Ki-Engi, often rendered as the land of the noble lords. To them, this was not an in-between place. It was the center. By around 3,500 BC, something extraordinary was happening there. In a world where many human communities still lived in small farming villages or moved in mobile bands, southern Mesopotamia was producing something new: cities. Not just big villages, actual cities. Places with populations in the tens of thousands. Places with organized administrations. Places where labor was specialized enough that one person's entire life might be spent tracking grain accounts, forging copper tools, shaping bricks, preparing offerings, or copying signs into wet clay. One of the earliest of these cities was Eridu, located at the site now called Abu Shahrain, in southern Iraq, not far from Ur. The Sumerians themselves remembered Eridu as the first city in the world, and that memory is preserved in one of the most important texts from Mesopotamia, the Sumerian king list, known from several manuscripts, including the famous Weld-Blundell Prism, now in Oxford. Its opening declaration is unforgettable. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. That line tells you almost everything about how the Sumerians thought. Kingship, in their understanding, did not begin as a human invention. It descended. It arrived. It was bestowed. It came from above into the human world and first took earthly form in a specific city. Eridu was also the city of Enki, god of wisdom, fresh water, and the subterranean sweet water, deep, called the Abzu. In Sumerian thought, Eridu was not just politically old, it was cosmologically primary. It was the place where order first took hold. Between about 3,500 and 2000 BC, other city-states spread across southern Mesopotamia: Uruk, Nippur, Lagash-Kish, Sippar, Larsa. Each had its own patron deity, each had its own sacred precinct, and each was organized around a temple complex built to anchor divine presence within the city. At the heart of those complexes stood structures that rose above the flat plain like artificial mountains, stepped platforms built from sun-dried mud brick, rising in stages, narrowing as they climbed, crowned by a shrine at the summit. These were the ziggurats. The word we use comes through Akkadian from zigguratu, meaning something like raised up or built on a height. But the older Sumerian terminology is even more revealing. One expression associated with these structures can be rendered as the house whose foundation creates awe, or even the house with the terrifying foundation. That phrase is worth slowing down for, because for the Sumerians, the foundation of a sacred structure did not simply support a building. It generated force. It radiated presence. It carried what they called melum, a kind of divine brilliance aura, or terrifying sacred radiance. And they did not treat that as a metaphor. They treated it as something real. At Ur, the great ziggurat, excavated by Woolley, was immense. Its base measured about 64 meters long and 46 meters wide. The surviving first terrace rises around 11 meters above the plain. Originally, it had 3 levels, perhaps more, crowned by a temple dedicated to Nana, the moon god and patron deity of the city. Even its architecture tells a story. Its walls lean inward slightly rather than rising straight, which makes the whole structure appear even more massive when viewed from below. Its core is solid. There are no hidden passageways inside, no hollow chambers, no secret interior staircases. To reach the upper levels, one had to ascend from the outside, and there was only one way up. 3 monumental stairways approached the structure. A central staircase rose directly toward it. 2 flanking staircases climbed from the sides. All 3 converged at a single point of entry before the ascent continued upward. That design is not subtle. Every approach arose. Every movement funnels toward control. Every path upward passes through one regulated threshold. And that is where our real investigation begins. Around the Ziggurat at Ur stood an entire sacred world enclosed within walls. This precinct was known as the Temenos, the Holy District. Inside it were multiple buildings, each with a specific role in maintaining the life of the god and the ordered life of the city. There was the main temple of Nana. There was a temple for Ningal Nana's divine consort. There were treasury buildings, administrative quarters, ceremonial halls, courts, storerooms, and ritual spaces that worked together as a single system. And one structure in particular matters for what we are trying to understand. This was the Jiparu. Woolley described it as something like the fortified residence of the high priestess, but even that does not fully capture what it was. It was not simply a house. It was not simply a temple annex. It was not just an administrative building attached to the sacred district. It was all of those things at once, woven together into a carefully controlled environment. It sat southwest of the main temple, built on a site associated with the cult of Nana. Its footprint was nearly square, measuring roughly 79 meters by 76.5 meters. The outer walls were enormous, more than 4.5 meters thick in places. Inside those walls ran a narrow internal corridor. Within the complex were sanctuaries, service rooms, storage rooms, bathing, and purification installations, a formal bedchamber, and what Woolley believed were subterranean burial rooms for successive high priestesses. Pause on that for a moment. The woman who occupied this office did not merely work near the sacred center. She lived there. She performed ritual there. She was probably buried there. Her whole life, once appointed, unfolded inside a sealed environment within an already sealed sacred precinct. This was not a casual role. This was not an ordinary priestly assignment, and the continuity is astonishing. The Jiparu remained in use from the reign of Ur-Nammu around 2100 BC until its final destruction in the late 18th century BC when the city was attacked under Samsu-Iluna, son of Hammurabi. That means more than 1,000 years of continuous ritual use. More than a millennium in which some specific type of person repeatedly entered, inhabited, and maintained these inner spaces, while others did not. So the question is no longer whether access was restricted. It absolutely was. The question is why those restrictions existed and how the people who enforced them understood them. To answer that, we need to step back and look at the structure of the Sumerian city itself. Because at its deepest level, the Sumerian city was not organized around trade. Though trade mattered, it was not organized around military power, though military power certainly mattered too. It was organized around the temple. The temple was not just a religious monument. It was the literal house of the god. Not symbolic in the modern sense, literal in theirs. The deity of the city was believed to dwell within the temple's innermost sanctuary, often in connection with a cult statue housed in a chamber so restricted that only a tiny number of people would ever enter it. The god required daily service. Food had to be prepared and presented. Garments had to be changed at the proper festivals. Music had to be performed. Offerings had to be made. Purification rites had to be observed. Calendar rituals had to be timed correctly, according to celestial cycles. Every one of these things was part of divine household maintenance. Temple staff in this framework were exactly that, the household staff of the god. But this service was not evenly distributed. There was a gradient of access. Ordinary people could enter public courtyards. They could bring offerings. They could observe major rituals from certain spaces. Lesser officials and temple workers moved farther inward into areas where storage, accounting, preparation, and service took place. Priests and specialized personnel occupied still more restricted zones. But at the farthest point inward, at the innermost sanctuary, access narrowed to almost no one. That narrowing was not random. It was not simply the result of bureaucratic hierarchy. The record suggests that it reflected something older and deeper, a structure of order believed to have existed before the present arrangement of the world. The farther inward one moved, the more one approached not merely prestige, but dangerous proximity. And that brings us to one of the most important categories in Sumerian thought, the ME. To understand why certain people could enter and others could not, we have to understand how writing preserved the Sumerians' own explanation of reality. In the late summer of 1835, a British army officer named Henry Rawlinson was stationed in western Iran as a military advisor. Near the city of Kermanshah, there rose a cliff known as Behistun. Carved high into its rock face, about 100 meters above the ground, was a trilingual inscription commissioned by the Persian king Darius I in the late 6th century BC. It was written in Old Persian Elamite and Babylonian cuneiform. Rawlinson copied it at great personal risk, working from ropes and scaffolding. Over years of effort, he pieced together a reliable key to deciphering the Babylonian script. By 1851, for the first time in nearly 2,000 years, a human being could once again read the wedge-shaped writing of ancient Mesopotamia. And what Mesopotamia had written down was almost everything. The word cuneiform comes from Latin roots, meaning wedge-shaped. The script was made by pressing a stylus into wet clay. At first, it was not used for stories, hymns, or philosophy. It began as accounting, lists of grain, counts of animals, distribution records, labor assignments. Temple economies were large enough that human memory alone could no longer manage them. Clay could. That mattered. A clay tablet once dried or fired could last for millennia, and many did. Today we have roughly 500,000 cuneiform tablets from Mesopotamia, preserving legal cases, astronomical observations, hymns, myths, royal inscriptions, medical recipes, omen texts, school exercises, contracts, and administrative records. Writing began as management, then it became memory, then it became literature. By the mid-3rd millennium, BC scribal schools called aduba, literally tablet houses, were training students not only in accounting and arithmetic, but in the language categories and thought world of Sumerian civilization. These schools were connected to temple institutions. Knowledge passed through priestly and administrative channels. What was taught, preserved, copied, and archived was filtered through institutions that saw themselves not as inventors of civilization, but as custodians of something transmitted from the gods. That distinction matters enormously. The Sumerians did not think civilization had been invented by clever humans. They believed it had been handed down. And the term they used for the deep structure of that handed-down order was the ME. One of the clearest texts for understanding this is the composition usually called Inanna and Enki. In this narrative, the goddess Inanna travels to Eridu to visit Enki, the god of wisdom and keeper of the ME. During the course of a banquet, Enki gives these ME to her one after another, and the text lists them in striking detail. They include kingship, priesthood, the scribal art, judgment, craftsmanship, musical performance, divine offices, temple roles, and the ordered structures of society itself. So, what exactly are the ME? The most common scholarly interpretation is that they are the divine templates or ordinances underlying civilized life. Not merely rules and not merely ideas, but foundational patterns that make a thing what it is. Kingship has a ME. Priesthood has a ME. The craft of the smith has a ME. The role of the high priestess has a ME. In other words, Sumerian civilization was understood as resting on invisible but real forms of order that had to be correctly embodied if the world was to remain stable. And once you understand that, the access restrictions of the temple begin to look different, because if offices' roles and sacred functions are grounded in divine templates rather than human convenience, then entering the inner sanctuary is no longer just about having permission. It becomes a question of whether you are the right kind of person to stand there at all. That is where the records are leading us next. If the ME were understood as the divine patterns that gave structure to civilization, then the qualifications for certain roles were not merely practical. They were not just a matter of training appointment or ambition. In the Sumerian framework, some functions existed because the universe itself had been ordered that way. And if that is true, then the question of who could enter the inner sanctuary becomes much more than an administrative detail. It becomes a question of fitness at the deepest possible level. This is why the records from temples and royal courts do not speak about sacred access the way a modern institution might. They do not describe the inner rooms as restricted because of privacy, prestige, or even simple religious decorum. Again and again, the language suggests something more serious. Certain people were believed to be suited to certain kinds of presence, and others were not. That idea becomes much clearer when we look at another foundational body of texts, the Sumerian king list. Today, one of the best-known copies of that text is the Weld Blundell Prism in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. It is a clay prism about 20 centimeters tall, inscribed on all four sides in dense columns of cuneiform. The version itself dates to around the early 19th century BC, but it preserves traditions much older than the object carrying them. And it opens with a line that sets the entire tone. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. That is how the Sumerians wanted to begin history. Not with a tribal chief, not with a warlord, not with a family gaining influence over generations. Kingship in this account came from somewhere above the human order and entered the world as a specific institution. It was not a human invention, it was a transferred reality. The text then moves into the deep past, listing kings who ruled before the flood, with reigns so vast that no modern reader can take them as ordinary historical biographies. Tens of thousands of years are assigned to individual rulers. Scholars have debated for generations what exactly those numbers mean. Some see literary symbolism. Some see cosmological time. Some see ritual numerology. Some see the deliberate marking off of a primordial age from the ordinary human world that followed. But whatever the numbers mean, the structure of the text is unmistakable. The world is divided into those who carry kingship and those who do not. The list does not say the strongest men became kings. It does not say the most successful military leaders took power. It says kingship descended. It says it was in one city, then another, transferred according to a pattern larger than human politics. That does not mean politics were absent. Of course they were not. But politics operated inside a framework that was already imagined as cosmological. Then comes the flood. After the flood, the text repeats the same essential idea. Kingship descends again. It re-enters the world. It is re-established. That matters for our question because it means the post-flood world was understood not as a fresh beginning, but as a restoration. The structures of civilization were not invented after the flood. They were rebuilt from an older order. Kingship was restored. Temple life was restored. The sacred hierarchy was restored. And if the temple hierarchy was part of that restoration, then the qualifications for access were not thought of as recent customs. They were part of an older design. This is the atmosphere in which temple access has to be understood. In that world, authority does not rise upward from society. It moves downward from the divine. A human being does not simply claim a sacred role. A sacred role is placed into human life by a prior order. The person who occupies that role is not just appointed. They are recognized as carrying something. And the text suggests that this recognition was closely tied to lineage. That point becomes even more striking when we return to the ME themselves. In the story of Inanna and Enki, Enki does not casually scatter the ME into the world. He bestows them. The language implies not just transfer, but transfer to one capable of bearing them. These things are not described like ordinary possessions. They are closer to powers, offices, conditions, or forms of order that have to be properly carried if they are to remain intact. In some passages, the ME almost sound like objects. They can be stored, they can be transported. Inanna famously carries them away by boat. But in other passages, they sound more like principles, living patterns that must be embodied in institutions, offices, and persons. That dual quality is important. The ME are not merely ideas. They are not merely things. They are the divine patterns that make a role real. And that includes the offices most closely tied to the inner temple. The high priestly office, the priestly office, the office of the Entu priestess, the rituals of descent and ascent, the rites connected to the underworld, the service of the cult statue. These are not presented as jobs that anyone can learn if given enough training. They are treated as realities with their own proper carriers. That is where bloodline enters the picture in a way deeper than political favoritism. Modern readers often hear that the king's daughter served as high priestess and immediately assume this was simply nepotism dressed in sacred language. And yes, royal families obviously benefited politically from controlling religious offices. No serious reading of ancient history should ignore that. But the records themselves speak as though something more was going on. They do not present the king's daughter as merely convenient. They present her as fitting. The distinction matters. In the text, the royal daughter is not just powerful enough for the role. She is suitable for it. Her birth into the ruling line is not a side detail. It is part of what qualifies her to become the human vessel of a divine office. Whether we accept that literally is another question, but that is how the system describes itself. And once you take that seriously, the inner sanctuary begins to look less like a private room and more like a space that demanded a specific kind of human presence. This helps explain another recurring concept in Mesopotamian sacred language, malam, the divine radiance or awe that emanates from God's sacred objects and sanctified spaces. Malam is often translated loosely as brilliance, terror, splendor, or numinous power. None of those quite captures it. It is something like a force of sacred intensity, a presence that overwhelms ordinary human boundaries. It can inspire reverence, fear paralysis, or submission. It is not decorative, it is active. If the inner sanctuary was a place in which Melam was especially concentrated, then entering it without the proper constitution was not just improper, it was dangerous. And this is exactly the kind of thing the texts seem to imply. They do not say only the chosen may enter, because we want to preserve hierarchy. They imply only the chosen may enter, because the space itself requires them. In that framework, lineage matters, because lineage is understood to carry continuity. The right line does not just inherit authority, it inherits suitability. A sacred office is not invented fresh with each generation. It is transmitted. A family line becomes the channel through which a certain ME continues to be embodied over time. This is also why succession could become a crisis. If a role is merely political, then replacing one office holder with another is inconvenient, perhaps dramatic, but not cosmically dangerous. If the office is cosmically load-bearing, then the wrong person in the wrong place becomes a threat not only to the institution, but to the order the institution exists to maintain. The farther inward one moves in the temple, the less room there is for substitution. Outer service can be broad. Inner service narrows. Public ritual may involve many people. Inner ritual is entrusted to very few. Administration can be delegated. Presence at the threshold cannot be casually delegated. And all of this brings us back to the architecture itself. The design of these sacred complexes repeatedly stages movement inward through courts, gates, cleansing areas, and increasingly restricted rooms. That pattern mirrors the conceptual world of the texts. The building does not merely contain restriction. It expresses it. It teaches it. It forces the body to pass through narrowing degrees of access until only the properly qualified remain. So, by the time we reach the high priestess at Ur, living inside the Giparu, we are not looking at an isolated custom. We are looking at the living center of a very old idea. The next step is to see how that idea took concrete human form in one of the most remarkable figures in the ancient world. Enheduana, the first named author in recorded history, a royal daughter, a high priestess, and a woman whose own words bring us closer than almost any other source to the inside of the locked door. In the early 20th century, as Leonard Woolley's team worked through the layers of debris at Ur, one of the most revealing discoveries was not a treasure in the usual sense. It was a pattern. Bricks, rooms, inscriptions, tomb chambers, drains, purification installations, and administrative tablets all pointed to the same conclusion. The sacred heart of the city was not open space. It was carefully staged access. And at the center of that access stood one particular office, held again and again by women of the royal line. This was the office of the High Priestess of Nana, and the woman most famous for holding it was Enheduana. To understand why she matters so much, we need to be clear about what this office was. Enheduana was not simply a priestess in a broad or casual sense. She was not one ritual specialist among many. She occupied the role known as the Entu, the high priestess, whose life was bound to the temple of the moon god at Ur. She lived within the Giparu. She participated in rites inaccessible to almost everyone else. She stood at the edge of the innermost precinct in a position that combined royal lineage, sacred office, and direct ritual proximity. And that combination is exactly why her writings matter. Because when Enheduana speaks, we are not hearing an outsider describing temple life from the street. We are hearing someone who lived inside the system, someone formed by it, someone who knew from experience what it meant to be admitted and what it meant to be excluded. Enheduana was the daughter of Sargon of Akkad, the founder of the Akkadian Empire, usually regarded as the first empire in recorded history. Around 2285 BC, Sargon appointed her to the high priesthood of Nana at Ur. Whether her birth name was different, we do not know. History remembers her by the title she held, Enheduana, often translated as High Priestess Ornament of Heaven or Priestess Adorned by Heaven. That title is not a casual label. It tells you what kind of identity this was. The office was so complete that it could replace the ordinary name of the person who carried it. The role did not merely sit on top of the individual. It could absorb the individual into itself. And Enheduana left behind texts that changed history. In the collections of Yale, the Morgan Library, and other institutions, there survive copies of compositions attributed to her, including temple hymns, and a poem often called Nin Mesara, usually translated as Lady of the Largest Heart, or lady of all the Me. What makes this astonishing is not just the age of the text. It is that Enheduana names herself. She signs her work. She speaks as an author. She claims a voice inside the written record. That alone would make her extraordinary. But for our purposes, what matters even more is what she says about sacred access. Enheduana's writings are full of theological intensity, but they are also full of spatial reality. They describe temples not as pretty monuments or symbolic buildings, but as charged environments, places with thresholds, places with dangerous interiors, places where divine force is concentrated, and where not everyone belongs. In one of her temple hymns, speaking of sacred architecture, she describes the temple as possessing a pure aura and a terrifying interior. Its threshold keeps out the uninitiated. Its inner room is profound, ancient, and difficult to bear. That is not the language of public religiosity. That is the language of controlled approach. The temple in her writing is not merely holy in a vague sense. It is selective, and that selectivity becomes even more vivid in the most personal section of her surviving work, her account of exile and restoration. At some point during political upheaval after Sargon's death, Enheduana was driven from her office by a rebel named Lugal-Ain. This was not simply a palace dispute that happened to touch the temple. In her own telling, it was a rupture at the deepest level of identity. She writes of being cast out, of being forced from the sanctuary, of being made to leave the place where her office had bound her to the divine. What is so striking about this is how she describes the loss. She does not frame it like someone complaining that she has lost status, salary, or privilege. She describes it as a break in connection, as if the expulsion severed her from the condition she had been made to inhabit. She writes with the grief of someone whose place in the sacred order has been violently interrupted. That matters because it reveals how the office was understood from the inside. For Enheduana, the inner precinct was not just a workplace. It was not just a ceremonial residence. It was the place where a certain relationship was actively maintained, and when that access was lost, something more than position disappeared. Her appeal in these texts is not merely political, it is theological. She turns to the goddess Inanna, invoking her power, her force, her command over the Me themselves. She names divine attributes. She calls on cosmic order to recognize what has been broken. She is not arguing, I should get my office back because I deserve it. She is arguing that the wrongness of the situation is built into the structure of the universe, and eventually in the narrative arc of her poem she is restored. That restoration is not treated like an administrative correction. It is treated like re-entry into the proper order of things. She returns to the sacred space. The connection resumes. The office and the person are realigned. The threshold opens again. This is some of the most important evidence we have because it shows us how temple access felt to someone who actually held it. From the outside, we might be tempted to reduce all of this to institutional language. Restrictions, offices, hierarchy, sacred protocol. From the inside, it appears as something deeper, a relationship, a burden, a specific kind of nearness to divine reality that could be lost and regained, but not casually transferred. This also helps us understand why the office was so often held by royal women. If the Enheduana priestess stood at a point where kingship, divine order, and temple service overlapped, then royal birth was not an accident. It was part of the logic. The ruling house carried kingship. The high priestess carried temple mediation. The daughter of the king stood at the place where those lines met. Again, one can interpret that politically. It certainly had political effects. But the system itself understood it as something more than politics. It understood it as proper correspondence. The right bloodline, the right office, the right sanctuary, the right rituals all aligned. And the building itself reinforced that alignment. Inside, the Japaru Wuli found installations for ritual washing. Just inside the entrance were brick-lined tanks waterproofed with bitumen. These were not decorative. Before entering farther into the complex, a person purified themselves. The farther inward one intended to go, the more serious preparation became. Washing here was not merely about cleanliness in the ordinary sense. It was ritual adjustment. It was preparing the body to cross into a different level of space. One room in particular, identified by Woolley as a lustration room, was laid out for that purpose. Benches lined the space. The floor sloped toward a drain. Water management was built into the room itself. This is not what you construct unless purification is an operational necessity. Beyond that, the rooms open into more restricted courts and sanctuaries. Woolley noted that even the king appears in these spaces as an occasional participant rather than a continuous resident. That detail is easy to miss, but it is very important. The king, though central to the system, was not the one who continuously inhabited the sacred interior. The high priestess did. She and her attendants maintained a form of life at the threshold that even royal power did not casually replace. This tells us something crucial. The highest authority in the city and the deepest access in the temple were related, but they were not identical. A king could build the ziggurat. A king could fund the temple. A king could appoint the priestess. But the records still preserve a difference between royal command and ritual inhabitation. That difference is the space Enheduana helps us see. She is one of the rare people whose words still carry the atmosphere of that inner world. And through her, the ziggurat stops being just an ancient monument on the skyline. It becomes what it was to the people who lived with it, a threshold machine, a place of approach, stripping purification, designation, and encounter. And once we see that, the next piece falls into place. Because Sumerian literature does not only describe who stood at the threshold, it also preserves a map of what passing through that threshold meant. On one of the most revealing texts in the whole Mesopotamian tradition is the composition usually called the Descent of Inanna. On the surface, it is a story about the goddess Inanna going down into the underworld, passing through 7 gates, being stripped of her divine attributes, one by one, standing before the powers below, and dying before eventual restoration. It is dramatic, unforgettable, and often interpreted as a myth about death fertility, the seasonal cycle, or the relationship between heaven and the underworld. All of those readings have value, but the text is also something else. It is a map of threshold. And once you place that map beside the architecture of the sacred precincts at cities like Uruk, the parallel becomes very hard to ignore. In the story, Inanna begins her descent fully adorned. She carries the marks of who she is: her crown, her jewelry, her royal garments, her measuring rod, and line her breastplate, her symbols of power. At each gate, she is stopped. At each gate, something is removed. A gatekeeper demands surrender. One attribute after another is stripped away until by the time she stands in the innermost presence of the underworld, nothing external remains. She enters bare. No outer symbol protects her. No ornament speaks for her. What remains is only what cannot be removed. That structure matters because it closely resembles the logic of sacred access in the temple complexes we have been examining. To move inward is not simply to walk deeper into a building. It is to pass through stages of reduction, qualification, and recognition. Each threshold narrows what may continue. The public is left behind. Then the ordinary official world is left behind. Then outer ritual service is left behind. Then even certain high-ranking forms of access stop. The path inward is always a path of subtraction. And the goal is not privacy. The goal is revelation. What remains when everything removable has been removed? That is the real question the descent asks. And it may also be the question the temple asks. At Ur, when Woolley reconstructed the sequence of movement through the precinct, the pattern was striking. One past the outer wall, then the formal entry, then successive courts, then purification areas, then inner rooms, then the sanctuary itself. Depending on which exact route and which building one maps in detail, the number of thresholds can vary, but the principle remains unmistakable: progressive access, progressive stripping, progressive narrowing. The sacred world is built as a series of gates, and the literary world reflects the same design. This does not mean the Descent of Inanna is secretly an architectural manual. That would be too narrow. It is a theological text, a mythic text, a ritual text, and probably an initiatory text all at once. But what it preserves is a way of thinking about sacred movement. The inner place is never casually entered. One reaches it only by surrendering what is outward. This helps explain why lineage mattered in the way the records suggest it did. Because if the inner threshold tests not status, but constitution, then no outer sign is enough. Wealth is not enough. Office alone is not enough. Public rank is not enough. One can lose the crown, the garments, the tools of office, the social marks, and still have to stand recognized or unrecognized by what remains. In Sumerian terms, that irreducible remainder is very close to what the ME represent in lived human form. Not costume, not symbol, not borrowed authority. Something carried at the deepest level. That is why the texts often feel as though they are talking about sacred roles in two ways at once. On one level, yes, these roles are institutional. They exist in lists. They appear in archives. They can be named and recorded. But on another level, they are ontological. They describe what kind of being a person must be in order to carry a certain office without distorting it. The descent story makes that logic visible. At each gate, what can be removed is removed. If nothing essential remains after the stripping, the person cannot stand. And this is exactly the point where modern readers often feel the distance between our categories and theirs. We are used to asking whether a role is learned or inherited, social or spiritual, symbolic or real. The Sumerians seem to have had much less interest in separating those things cleanly. For them, a sacred office could be all of those at once. It could be inherited through lineage, ritually confirmed through ceremony, socially enacted through institutional structures, and cosmologically grounded through the divine order. That layered logic appears again and again, and it becomes even clearer when we turn to another major body of evidence, the Gudea cylinders. These are among the longest surviving literary texts in the Sumerian language, inscribed on two great clay cylinders from the city of Lagash, now in the Louvre. They date to the reign of Gudea, around 21-25 BC, and they describe in extraordinary detail the building of the temple Eninu for the god Ningirsu. What is so important about these cylinders is not only that they describe temple construction, it is how they describe it. Gudea does not simply decide to build. He is chosen. He receives a dream. He does not fully understand it. He seeks interpretation. He performs rituals. He consults divine signs. He purifies the city. He organizes labor according to sacred specification. Only then does construction begin. This is a profound difference from how monumental construction is usually described in later imperial traditions. In many societies, a ruler builds to display power, wealth, permanence, or glory. In the Gudea cylinders, the ruler's greatness lies not in imposing his own vision, but in receiving and correctly transmitting a vision he did not originate. That is a major pattern in Mesopotamian sacred building. The builder is not fundamentally self-authorizing. He is designated. The temple is not his monument. It is the god's house. And the text goes further. It specifies the kinds of people who may and may not participate in the work. The impure must not approach. The angry must not approach. The liar must not approach. One who has not washed properly must not handle the materials. These are not just moral warnings. They are statements about the compatibility between human presence and sacred construction. The building is treated as a living reality in formation. Wrong presence disturbs it. Wrong condition disturbs it. Wrong intention disturbs it. And once the god enters, the completed temple access becomes even more charged. The cylinders then move into the arrangement of service, the order of rituals, the preparation of the precinct, and the ongoing life of the temple. As with the further inward one goes, the more the question shifts from ordinary labor to sacred qualification. What Gudea inscriptions show is that this way of thinking was not unique to one city. Had it. Lagash had it too. Different god, different political context, same basic logic. Divine designation, ritual preparation, controlled access. The sacred center requiring not merely service, but the right kind of service from the right kind of people. And this matters because it strengthens the larger case. We are not dealing with an isolated custom from one archive at one city. We are seeing a civilization-wide pattern. Temples are built through authorization, not self-assertion. Sacred presence is housed through proper order, not mere construction. Inner access depends on suitability, not just administration. This is also why the idea of the temple as a literal house of the god should be taken seriously. In the Mesopotamian framework, a house is maintained according to the nature of its inhabitant. The divine resident requires not only food, music offerings, and textiles, but atmosphere, purity, order, and correctly aligned human roles. A sanctuary is not just a room. It is a zone where the conditions of divine residence are actively sustained. That is why the wrong person in the wrong room is not a minor problem. It is a disturbance of the conditions that make the room what it is. Which brings us naturally to the question of law, because by the time of Ur-Nammu, these ideas are not floating only in literary texts and hymns. They have entered the language of governance itself. Sacred order and legal order are no longer separate domains. They are different faces of the same world. And once law begins protecting the threshold, the civilization is telling us something very clearly. This restriction was not optional. It was structural. By the time we reach the age of Ur-Nammu, the founder of the third dynasty of Ur, the world of temple access is no longer something we have to reconstruct only from hymns, stories, and architectural remains. It also appears in law administration and institutional practice. And this is where the picture becomes even sharper. Because once a civilization begins writing down who may do what, where, and under what conditions, we are no longer dealing only with symbolic language. We are dealing with enforcement. Ur-Nammu is especially important here. He is the king shown on the great limestone stele we began with the ruler receiving divine authorization to build the Ziggurat. He is also associated with the oldest surviving law code, yet known, a legal collection written in Sumerian and dating to around 2100 to 2500 BC, more than 3 centuries before the better-known Code of Hammurabi. The surviving copies are fragmentary, but enough remains to show the shape of the legal world he was building. This was not a primitive or improvisational system. It was already highly structured. The code addresses false accusations, bodily injury, agricultural responsibilities, compensation, social order, and the protection of vulnerable people. Scholars have often noted how sophisticated it is for such an early legal text. It does not present a world where raw power alone determines justice. It presents a world in which order is supposed to be defined articulated and maintained. And in the same broader context, temple administration becomes increasingly visible in written records. The king's authority and the temple's authority are not separate things awkwardly forced together. They are mutually reinforcing aspects of a single cosmological order. Ur-Nammu's own royal ideology makes that clear. His legal authority comes from divine selection, and one of the first major acts tied to that authority is the building of Nana's Ziggurat. In other words, law and temple are not parallel institutions. They are expressions of the same arrangement of reality. That point matters enormously, because if the king's legitimacy comes from divine order, and the temple is the earthly house of divine presence, then regulating access to sacred space is not a side issue. It becomes one of the central duties of the state. The law protects the threshold because the threshold anchors the order the law itself depends on, and the administrative tablets from Ur make this concrete. These records, often dry and technical on the surface, list categories of temple personnel with remarkable precision. Different priests, singers, lamentation, performers, administrators, workers, attendants, and ritual specialists appear by title. Each office has a role. Each role has a place. Each place belongs within a graded spatial order. This is one of the most important things the tablets reveal. Not all temple personnel had the same access. A temple was not one room, it was a hierarchy of rooms, and the personnel attached to it were arranged accordingly. Some roles belonged to outer courts, some to ceremonial spaces open to larger groups, some to storage and preparation rooms, some to ritual performance in areas where offerings, music, and lamentation were carried out before wider audiences. But the deeper inward one goes, the narrower the list of qualified persons becomes. That narrowing is not casual, it is structured. A good example is the gala priest, known especially for performing lamentation liturgies. These figures were highly significant in Mesopotamian religion. Their role was not marginal. They gave voice to ritual grief. They helped mediate the emotional and ceremonial life of the city before its gods. Yet even they do not appear as occupants of the deepest sanctuary. Their work belonged to the outer and intermediate zones of divine service, not the innermost chamber. That distinction is revealing. Importance is not the same as access. Visibility is not the same as access. Ritual centrality is not the same as access. The deeper spaces demanded something else. And when the high priestess appears in these records, she appears differently from the rest. She is not merely another employee on the list. She is not just one more ritual functionary among many. Her office stands apart. She belongs to the structure in a way the others do not. She is not simply assigned to the temple. She is part of the logic by which the temple is inhabited. That is why the office is so often tied to royal blood. In the records, her qualification is not described as something learned in the same sense as scribal training, liturgical training, or administrative skill. It is assumed to arise from who she is specifically from her birth within the ruling line, later confirmed through ceremony, ritual, observation, and divine approval. This is a crucial distinction. The starting point is lineage. The completion of that qualification comes through recognition. So, lineage alone is not everything, but lineage is where the process begins. This also helps explain why violations of sacred order were treated so seriously. In modern terms, it is easy to imagine trespassing into a restricted religious space as a matter of etiquette or institutional discipline. In the Sumerian framework, unauthorized access was not just improper behavior. It could be treated as a kind of cosmic offense. The logic is visible in the broader category of acts considered abominable or disordering before heaven. The problem was not merely that someone broke a rule. The problem was that they disturbed the relation between the human and divine realms. That distinction changes everything. If sacred restriction is just bureaucracy, then violation is disobedience. If sacred restriction protects cosmic order, then violation becomes damage. And damage requires repair. This is why purification rituals matter so much in the documentary record. It is not enough to punish a person. The space itself has to be restored. The relationship has to be repaired. The temple is not simply a building with rules posted at the door. It is a living field of divine human interaction, and the wrong kind of contact can unsettle it. The more seriously we take this framework on its own terms, the more coherent the records become. The ziggurat is not just an elevated platform, it is the visible summit of a sacred system. The precinct is not just a cluster of buildings, it is a controlled environment for divine residence. The law is not just civic regulation, it is the earthly enforcement of cosmic order. And the high priestess is not merely a politically useful daughter of the king. She is the designated carrier of a role believed to be necessary for the right relationship between city and God. Now, of course, a modern reader can still say all of this functioned politically. It certainly did. A dynasty that controls the temple controls legitimacy, memory, and ritual prestige. No one should romanticize ancient power. But the written evidence keeps pressing us toward a stronger conclusion than simple political opportunism. These people believed the restriction itself was necessary, not convenient, necessary. And once you see that another pattern in the records, becomes much easier to understand continuity across disaster. Cities fall, dynasties change, foreign rulers take control, temples are damaged, rebuilt, repurposed, and restored. Yet certain protocols persist. The office of the high priestess persists. The link to the ruling house persists. The graded access of the sacred precinct persists. Why? Because from within the system, these things are not optional customs that can be casually revised. They are restorations of an older order. That is where the flood traditions become relevant. Across Mesopotamian literature, especially in the Sumerian king list, and later Akkadian texts like Atrahasis, the flood, is not just a disaster story. It is a rupture in the transmission of order. The world before the flood and the world after it are linked, but not continuously. Something has to be reestablished. Kingship descends again. Civilization is reconfigured again. The structures of life are restored. If that is how Mesopotamians understood the deep past, then the institutions of temple access were not being invented by each generation. They were being reconstituted according to a pattern believed to predate the current world. That is an extraordinary claim. And whether one reads it symbolically, philosophically, or literally, it gives the sacred threshold a very different weight. It is no longer just the boundary of a building. It becomes the boundary of a transmitted order, a point where the present must be kept aligned with something older than memory, which is why the next group of texts matters so much. Because in the flood traditions, especially Atrahasis, the question is not only who survives catastrophe, it is what exactly is meant to survive through them. In the Atrahasis epic, one of the great flood narratives of ancient Mesopotamia, the story begins not with rain or destruction, but with labor. Before humans existed, the text says the lesser gods were doing the hard work of maintaining the world. They dug canals. They moved earth. They carried out the exhausting labor required to sustain cosmic order. Eventually, they rebelled. They refused the burden. And the higher gods were forced to respond. Their solution was not to reduce the work. Their solution was to create humanity. That point is easy to miss because the flood often overshadows everything else in the story. But the creation passage is crucial. Human beings in this framework were made for service, not in a vague moral sense, in a specific cultic and cosmic sense. They were made to carry forward the work that sustained the divine human order. This service includes agriculture labor craft and social maintenance. But in Mesopotamian thought, it also includes temple service, the preparation of food for the gods, the upkeep of sacred houses, the maintenance of ritual order, the preservation of correct relations between heaven-earth and the underworld. Humanity exists in part to sustain the conditions in which divine order can remain active in the world. And yet even here, the service is not all the same. The text suggests that all humans participate in the divine economy in a broad sense, but only some are fitted for its innermost forms. Everyone can serve the gods through labor production, obedience, and public ritual. Not everyone can stand at the threshold of concentrated divine presence. That distinction matters because it echoes everything we have already seen in the temple archives and architectural evidence. There is a difference between general service and inner service. General service sustains the system from the outside. Inner service sustains it from the center. That is why flood traditions matter so much for our investigation. Because the flood is not just about survival, it is about continuity. What survives through catastrophe, what must be carried across the break. In the Mesopotamian worldview, what must survive is not merely human life in a biological sense. What must survive is order, the templates of civilization, the conditions under which divine and human worlds remain properly related. And once again, that brings us back to transmission. In Atrahasis, the survivor is not selected randomly. He is recognized. He is the one who can receive the warning, preserve what matters, and carry forward a continuity that would otherwise be lost. Whether we interpret that as wisdom, divine favor, ritual qualification, or something more mysterious, the structure is clear. The right person survives because he is capable of receiving and preserving what must continue. The same pattern appears in the post-flood king list. After the flood, kingship descends again. Not is invented again, not is negotiated again, descends again. That repeated phrase tells us how Mesopotamians imagined restoration. Institutions are reestablished because they belong to an order older than the present world. They are not products of convenience. They are recoveries of something primordial. If temple access was part of that restored order, then its restrictions were not merely recent customs or political tricks. They were inherited as part of the architecture of civilization itself. Now, the texts never come out and say in one clean sentence that the bloodline rules of the high priesthood came directly from before the flood. Ancient sources are rarely that neat, but they do repeatedly connect post-flood civilization with restored divine order. And they do repeatedly connect sacred office with designation, suitability, and lineage. That does not prove one single theory beyond doubt, but it does create a framework in which the bloodline principle makes deep internal sense. It is not just about privilege, it is about continuity. If the inner chamber is where the most concentrated form of divine human exchange is maintained, then the people admitted there must be those through whom continuity can be trusted. In one reading, that continuity is dynastic and political. In another, it is spiritual and philosophical. In another, more literal reading, it may point to the preservation of some real but poorly understood qualification carried through lineage. The evidence does not fully settle the matter, but it keeps returning us to the same structure. Transmission requires carriers. The inner sanctuary is where transmission is maintained, and only certain people are recognized as suitable carriers. This pattern becomes even stronger when we compare multiple Sumerian cities rather than focusing only on At Nippur, the city of Enlil, the great temple Ikur stood at the center of one of the most sacred sites in Mesopotamia. Nippur was not just another city among many. In theological terms, it was the cosmic center, the place where the authority of Enlil lord of wind command, and divine decree was anchored on earth. Excavations there produced vast numbers of tablets, including administrative records, hymns, and literary texts tied to temple service. And what do those texts show? The same broad pattern. The temple is divided into more and less restricted zones. The threshold is treated as an active boundary. The inner precinct is occupied by the divinely appointed. The personnel of the sanctuary are differentiated not just by task, but by level of nearness. At Uruk, one of the earliest great cities in the world, the sacred district of Inanna provides still earlier evidence. The famous Uruk Vas shows a ritual procession bringing offerings upward toward the temple, with a key figure standing at the threshold between outer procession and inner presentation. That image is important because it captures a moment of transition. Many people move in ordered approach, but the crossing itself narrows. The threshold is where multiplicity becomes singularity. Even in the earliest administrative tablets from Uruk, where writing is still young and often frustratingly difficult to interpret, distinctions already appear between outer and inner service. The system is still embryonic in written form, but the logic is already there. Some people are associated with broad precinct activity. Others belong more closely to the sanctuary. Then there is Eridu. Eridu may be the most quietly important city of all for this subject, because its sacred history goes back even earlier than writing. Excavators found 17 successive temple levels built one atop another on the same site. Long before formal administration, long before the archives, long before royal law codes, the same sacred spot was rebuilt again and again. That continuity matters. It means the principle of restricted sacred space predates the written systems that later describe it. At the deepest layers, there are no administrative tablets telling us who may enter. There are no lists of personnel, no law collections, no royal inscriptions, and yet the sacred center is clearly being maintained through repeated rebuilding. How does a system of inner access survive without writing? By habit, by embodied practice, by lineage, by the kind of continuity that does not need to be written down, because it is carried inside families' offices and repeated ritual life. This is one of the strongest reasons not to reduce everything to late political ideology. The pattern is older than the textual systems that justify it. Writing did not invent the sacred threshold. Writing recorded, reinforced, and preserved something already old. So across Eridu, Uruk, Nippur, and across different gods, different local traditions, and different political histories, the same principle appears again and again. The sacred center narrows. Access is graded. The innermost space belongs only to those recognized as suited for it. And that suitability is consistently tied, at least in the most important offices, to lineage joined with confirmation. At this point, we have enough evidence to say something with real confidence. The restriction itself was real. The graded architecture was real. The legal and administrative enforcement was real. The continuity across cities was real. What remains open is the deepest question of interpretation. What exactly did the Sumerians think made a person suitable? What did they believe lineage carried? And how should we read that language today? There are, broadly speaking, 3 ways to answer that. And to be intellectually honest, we need to walk through all 3. At this point, the evidence is substantial. We have architecture, legal texts, administrative records, literary compositions, royal inscriptions, and temple hymns, all pointing in the same direction. The inner chambers of the Sumerian sacred precinct were restricted. Those restrictions were not casual. They were tied to designated roles. And in the highest forms of access, especially the office of the high priestess lineage, mattered in a way the texts describe as foundational. The question is how to interpret that. And there are really 3 major ways of reading what the tablets and buildings are telling us. The first is the mainstream symbolic reading. This is the interpretation most commonly favored in modern scholarship, and it has real strengths. In this view, the language of divine designation, sacred bloodline, and the ME as cosmic ordinances expresses a political and religious system in symbolic form. The royal family controlled access to the highest temple offices because sacred authority reinforced political authority. Putting the king's daughter into the inner precinct was a way of binding temple and throne together. It prevented the emergence of a rival priestly institution. It gave divine legitimacy to the ruling line. And the language of cosmic necessity was the language through which that political arrangement justified itself. There is a lot to support this reading. Empires really did use religious structures to consolidate power. Sargon's appointment of Enheduana was certainly politically useful. Later rulers who took over cities often kept the same sacred offices in place because religious continuity stabilized their rule. If one asks whether temple access had political consequences, the answer is obviously yes. And yet the symbolic reading leaves a certain residue behind, because the texts do not speak as though they are merely dressing politics in sacred clothing. They speak as though the sacred structure itself is primary. Enheduana does not describe her exile as a political inconvenience. The temple hymns do not describe the threshold as a useful metaphor for royal control. The law codes and administrative records do not treat access as a matter of prestige management. They assume something stronger. To make the symbolic reading fully work, one often has to say either that the people involved were consciously using religious language to mask power, or that they were unconsciously trapped inside an ideology they did not understand. Both possibilities exist. Ancient people were just as capable of strategic thinking as we are. But there is something a little too easy about dismissing their own explanations the moment they become metaphysically serious. That leads to the second reading. This is what we might call the encoded wisdom reading. In this interpretation, the texts are not lying, and they are not merely covering politics, but they are also not meant to be taken in a crudely literal sense. The bloodline language in this view encodes a real principle about transmission. Sacred capacity is inherited not because of biology alone, but because lineages preserve forms of training, ritual, memory, discipline, symbolic understanding, and lived continuity that cannot be recreated instantly by outsiders. Under this reading, when the texts say a person carries the proper ME, they are speaking about a genuine human suitability formed across generations. The right family is not just genetically special. It is the family shaped over time to bear a certain sacred burden. Bloodline becomes the visible expression of deeper continuity. There is much to recommend this interpretation too. Many traditions, ancient and modern, use the language of descent to talk about the transmission of wisdom, obligation, initiation, or vocation. Families and lineages can preserve forms of life that are not easily transferable. A child born into a ruling sacred household would absorb assumptions, gestures, disciplines, and relationships from the beginning of life. That does not make the sacred language false, it makes it dense. And yet this reading also has limits. Because the Sumerian texts are often more literal than this interpretation wants them to be. They do not always talk as though lineage is simply the carrier of tradition. They talk as though lineage itself is bound up with qualification at a deep structural level. The distinction between learned skill and sacred suitability appears too clearly in too many places to be fully collapsed into cultural upbringing. The texts seem to insist on a difference between what one can learn and what one must already, in some sense, be. Which brings us to the third reading. This is the most literal and the most unsettling for modern habits of thought. We might call it the historical documentary reading. In this interpretation, the Mesopotamian texts are taken seriously as records of how the Sumerians understood real experiences. The sacred threshold was not just symbolic. The inner chamber was not just politically charged. The melem, the divine presence, the cosmic danger, the necessity of proper carriers. These were descriptions of realities as the Sumerians encountered them. The bloodline requirements were not only about legitimacy or inherited training. They reflected the belief that certain lineages genuinely carried a quality required for direct contact with concentrated divine presence. Notice what this does not require. It does not require us to accept every theological claim at face value in a modern religious sense. It does not require us to decide what the gods objectively were. It does not require us to prove scientifically that a sanctuary literally recognized bloodlines. It only requires us to grant that the Sumerians may have been reporting their world as seriously as they knew how, rather than merely disguising politics as religion. This reading has its own strength. It respects the evidence without flattening it. It allows Enheduana to mean what she says. It allows the temple hymns to describe actual sacred experience rather than decorative metaphor. It allows the repetition across cities and centuries to signal not just ideology, but continuity of perception. But it also comes with a clear limitation. It cannot be verified in the way archaeology verifies brick dimensions or artifact layers. We can excavate a lustration tank. We can read an inscription. We can trace the succession of high priestesses. We cannot excavate melem. We cannot test the sacred constitution of a bloodline in a laboratory. At some point, interpretation reaches the edge of what physical evidence can settle. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with something surprisingly honest. The evidence does not force one single metaphysical conclusion. It does, however, force a historical one. The Sumerians treated inner access as real, restricted, and necessary. They did not treat it as optional symbolism. They built for it. They legislated for it. They recorded it. They restored it after disruption. They tied it to office ritual and lineage in ways that remained stable across very long stretches of time. And once that much is clear, the modern reader is no longer free to treat the whole matter casually. One may disagree with the Sumerians. One may naturalize their worldview. One may translate it into political anthropology, ritual theory, or comparative religion. But one cannot honestly pretend they were vague. They were precise. The threshold mattered. The inner room mattered. The question of who could stand there mattered. And that brings us back, in a way, to the Ziggurat itself. Because the Ziggurat is often shown in documentaries and textbooks as if it were mainly a dramatic shape on the landscape, a giant stepped mound, impressive but abstract. Yet for the people who built and served these complexes, it was never just a skyline object. It was the visible summit of an entire philosophy of approach. The broad base belongs to the city. The precinct belongs to the god. The courtyards belong to different layers of service. The inner sanctuary belongs to almost no one. The architecture itself teaches the social theology. As you move upward or inward, human multiplicity diminishes. Crowds become attendants. Attendants become specialists. Specialists become designated carriers. And finally, near the center, one or two people remain where many began. That is not accidental design. That is worldview in brick. And this is why the final sections of our investigation matter so much. Because once we understand the pattern, we can ask the larger question it leaves behind. What was all of this for? Why maintain such an elaborate system for so long? Why rebuild it across centuries? Why bind law, architecture, hymn, and bloodline into one continuous logic? Why treat the inner chambers as if the order of the world depended on them? The answer the records keep circling is simple, though not easy. Because in the Sumerian imagination, those chambers were not empty. They were the places where civilization itself was kept aligned with the forces that made civilization possible. And if that is true, then the final question is not only who entered, it is what exactly they believed they were maintaining once they got inside. To understand why the inner chambers mattered so much, we have to return to the most basic Sumerian assumption about civilization itself. Civilization, in their view, was not self-sustaining. It did not simply continue because people planted crops, traded goods, and raised children. Those things mattered, of course. But beneath them was a deeper requirement. The world had to remain properly ordered. The divine patterns underlying kingship, priesthood, justice, craft, fertility, and cosmic balance had to remain active. They had to be maintained not once, but continuously. That is what the temple was for, not as a monument to belief, but as an operating center. The temple did not merely express a relationship between humans and gods. It maintained that relationship. Daily offerings were not symbolic gestures. They were acts of sustenance. Ritual washing was not decorative. It was preparation for contact. Music, incense, food, textiles, recitation procession, and timed ceremony were all parts of a living system of upkeep. The god dwelled in the house. The house had to be kept in order. And if the temple was the house of the god, then the innermost room was the point of highest intensity, the place where divine presence was most concentrated and therefore most demanding. That is why the sacred staff of the temple formed a gradient rather than a single undifferentiated body. The closer one came to the center, the more exact the qualification had to be, not because the Sumerians enjoyed exclusion for its own sake, but because the inner room was thought to be load-bearing in the most serious sense. It was where the city's relationship with its divine patron was renewed. It was where the ME were not merely discussed or represented, but actively sustained in practice. The cosmic order was not an abstract theory floating somewhere above life. It had to be serviced, aligned, fed, clothed, honored, and correctly approached. This is also why the language of temple texts so often feels strangely practical, even when it is metaphysical. The gods need food. The statue needs tending. The threshold keeps out the unqualified. The sanctuary requires purification. The priestess must be confirmed. The ritual calendar must be kept. Nothing in this world is left to vague sentiment. Divine order is intimate with administration. Sacred presence is intimate with logistics. The cosmic and the bureaucratic are intertwined because both belong to maintenance. And that may be the key to the whole system. The inner chambers mattered because they were the maintenance point. They were where invisible order was serviced in visible act. Once you see that, the enormous continuity of the system becomes easier to understand. Why rebuild a temple on the same foundations over centuries? Why preserve priestly roles across dynastic collapse? Why restore a damaged sanctuary instead of replacing it with some completely new arrangement? Because the point was not innovation. The point was continuity. A sacred center was not valuable because it was old in a sentimental sense. It was valuable because it remained the proper place where alignment had long been maintained. That is why Eridu matters so much. 17 temple levels, one above another, preserving the same sacred location across immense spans of time. That is why matters. That is why the office of the high priestess matters. The concern is always the same. Keep the line unbroken. Keep the order intact. Keep the right person in the right place, doing the right actions at the right time. The temple is not just sacred architecture. It is continuity made visible, and the inner sanctuary is continuity at its narrowest point. This is where the role of the Enheduana priestess becomes even more important. She was not only an official, she was in a very real sense the human anchor of that narrow point. The temple archives and literary texts suggest that her office was not interchangeable with others. It was specific. The king could not simply step into it. A lower priest could not casually assume it. A random devout citizen could not aspire to it. The role existed as a distinct channel. That distinction can sound strange to modern ears because we are used to imagining institutions as systems of transferable functions. In many modern settings, if one person leaves, another can be trained to replace them. But the Sumerian texts resist that model, at least for the innermost offices. They consistently imply that the most important sacred roles are not only functional, they are constitutive. They are tied to what a person is in relation to the order they serve. That is why replacement could be so destabilizing. That is why expulsion, as in Enheduana's case, could be described as rupture. That is why restoration mattered so much. Because the office was not merely empty space waiting for any qualified administrator, it required the proper vessel. And here we arrive at the deepest possible modern question. What did the Sumerians think the proper vessel actually carried? The texts answer with layered language. They speak of me, divine ordinances, sacred offices, designation, radiance, and ritual purity. They speak of bloodline, but also of confirmation. They speak of divine choice, but also of institutional continuity. They speak as if the role is inherited, recognized, and enacted all at once. From one angle, this can be read politically. From another, psychologically or spiritually. From another, historically, as a faithful report of the civilization's own experience. But whatever interpretation one prefers, the structure of the evidence keeps pulling us toward the same core insight. The inner room was thought to respond to presence. That is the part most worth sitting with. The temple hymns describe thresholds that distinguish. The rituals of purification assume that bodily and spiritual condition matter to the space being entered. The architecture narrows approach, as if some forms of presence may continue and others may not. The literary descent through the gates of the underworld strips away removable signs until only the essential remains. Again and again, the sacred center behaves not like a neutral room guarded by people, but like a zone that in the Sumerian imagination actively recognized what stood before it. That does not mean we can prove the room literally selected people, but it does mean the civilization repeatedly described sacred space as if it did. And that is not a small thing, because once a culture imagines space that way, everything changes. Purity is no longer just moral cleanliness. Lineage is no longer just inheritance. Office is no longer just authority. The sanctuary becomes an instrument of recognition. Those who belong can stand there. Those who do not belong cannot or should not. And whether one interprets that as theology, ritual, psychology, social technology, or genuine sacred experience, the pattern remains astonishingly consistent. So, when later generations looked up at the Ziggurat, they were not just seeing a high building, they were seeing the outward form of a filtered world. At the base was the city. Within the walls was the precinct. Within the precinct were the courts. Beyond the courts were the sanctuaries. Beyond the sanctuaries was the inner room. And at the heart of that room was the question no outer status could answer by itself. Who are you when everything removable has been taken away? That, more than any single artifact or inscription, may be the logic tying the whole system together. The inner chambers existed not simply to keep people out, but to preserve a place where only what was essential could remain. And that is why the records, for all their administrative precision, never quite feel merely administrative. They keep opening into something larger. Something uncomfortable, something still recognizable, a threshold, not just in stone, in human identity itself. The final step is to ask what all of this leaves us with now, after 4,000 years of silence, excavation, translation, and debate. Because the tablets do not only tell us what the Sumerians believed, they also leave us with a question we cannot easily put back down. What do we do with a civilization that speaks this clearly and still refuses to give us a final answer? That, in a way, is where all serious reading of the Sumerian record ends, not with certainty, but with a sharpened question. By now, the pattern is difficult to dismiss. Across multiple cities, across many centuries, through architecture, law, liturgy, royal inscription, and personal testimony, the same structure appears again and again. The inner chambers were real. The restrictions were real. The gradation from public to private, from outer to inner, from many to few, was not decorative. It was foundational. And the people maintaining that system believed, or at the very least, acted as if they believed that certain human beings were better fitted than others to stand in the closest presence of the divine. The texts say this in different ways. Sometimes they say it through office, sometimes through bloodline, sometimes through the language of the ME, sometimes through ritual purification, sometimes through the architecture itself, but they keep saying it. And perhaps the most interesting thing is that they say it without strain. They do not write like people arguing for a controversial new doctrine. They write like people describing the obvious structure of the world they inhabit. That quiet confidence matters. It tells us that by the time these records were being produced, the logic of the threshold was already deeply normal. A person could be important and still not be admitted. A person could serve the god and still not go inside. A king could build the ziggurat and still stand before the final boundary rather than beyond it. And a woman like Enheduana could lose access to the sacred center in a way that felt, in her own words, like an ontological break, not simply a political defeat. That is not accidental language. That is a worldview. And when a worldview appears this consistently, the task is not to flatten it too quickly into categories that make us comfortable. The task is first to understand it on its own terms. On those terms, the Sumerian world was layered. There was the visible city with its walls, markets, homes, workshops, fields, and canal systems. There was the sacred precinct where the city's divine relationship was concentrated. There was the temple complex where service became more exact. There was the inner sanctuary where almost everything fell away. And then there was the threshold itself, the point at which the civilization seems to have believed that human identity was tested against divine order. That is what gives the whole subject its unusual force. We are not simply looking at ancient religion in the broad, familiar sense. We are looking at a civilization that built spatially what many later traditions expressed philosophically, the idea that nearness to ultimate reality is not equally bearable to everyone, and that approach requires preparation, stripping qualification, and in some cases, inheritance. Even if one rejects the literal cosmology, that idea is still powerful. It suggests that sacred space was not sacred merely because people felt strongly about it. It was sacred because it was structured to produce a difference between outer identity and inner identity. The outer court still belonged to social life. The inner room demanded something prior to social performance. That may be why the descent texts matter so much. At each gate, the removable things are taken. The crown can go, the jewelry can go, the robes can go, the tools of office can go. Even the visible symbols of divine rank can go. What remains? That question is never fully answered in abstract terms. Instead, the civilization built places where the answer had to be enacted. Perhaps that is why these texts continue to feel strangely alive. Because even from a distance of 4 millennia, they still sound like records of contact with a problem that has never gone away, whether a human being is more than the visible marks of status, and whether there are forms of reality that answer not to performance, but to constitution. Now, to say that is not to romanticize Mesopotamia. This was a hard world. Its cities were unequal. Its institutions were capable of exclusion and control. Its sacred language could absolutely serve political ends. Its dynasties used theology to reinforce authority. All of that is true. But reducing the entire threshold system to power alone does not really explain its persistence, its emotional depth, its literary sophistication, or its cross-city continuity. Something stronger was being preserved, even if what was being preserved was a shared conviction rather than a measurable force. And that brings us to the question modern readers often feel, but do not always say aloud. Did the Sumerians think bloodline literally carried a sacred quality? The honest answer is that the evidence suggests they thought lineage mattered in a deep way, but it does not let us define that depth with scientific precision. The role of lineage is too consistent to dismiss, yet too entangled with ritual office and divine confirmation to reduce to genetics in any simple sense. Bloodline in their world was not merely biology and not merely metaphor. It was part of a larger grammar of transmission. A person was born into a line. That line carried office. That office carried relation. That relation carried responsibility. And in the innermost spaces of the temple, responsibility became almost indistinguishable from being. That is a profoundly different way of understanding human roles than the one most modern people inherit. We tend to ask what someone does. The Sumerians, at least in these sacred contexts, seem also to have asked what someone is fitted to bear. That difference may be the most important thing the tablets preserve. Not a secret doctrine, not a hidden conspiracy, not proof of some modern fantasy projected backward, but a disciplined ancient insistence that reality is graded, that access matters, and that the deepest rooms of existence are not entered casually. If you stand back from all the individual inscriptions and rooms and titles, that may be the clearest pattern left in the dust. The ziggurat rises, the routes narrow, the doors reduce, the spaces purify, the roles become fewer, the center becomes quieter. And there, in that quiet center, the civilization placed not crowds, not even kings in the fullest sense, but designated figures whose lives were meant to hold the line between worlds. That is what the records say. Not in one place, in many, not once, repeatedly. And now we arrive at the strange final gift of ancient evidence. The tablets do not force belief. They do not settle metaphysics. They do not tell us exactly what the divine presence was, or whether the threshold literally recognized human beings the way the hymns imply. But they do preserve with extraordinary patience the shape of the question. And once you see that shape, it is difficult to unsee it. A civilization older than classical Greece, older than the Hebrew Bible in written form, older than Rome by millennia, took immense care to preserve the claim that certain places required certain people, and that those people were not chosen only by ambition, education, or force. Whether we read that symbolically, spiritually, politically, or historically, the claim remains one of the oldest and most persistent on Earth. The threshold matters. And in the next part, we bring everything back to the beginning, to the broken stone in Philadelphia, to the king before the god, and to the final question the Sumerian record leaves resting in silence. So let us return to the stone. In a climate-controlled storage space in Philadelphia, the broken limestone stele still waits in fragments, partly reconstructed, partly unresolved. Ur-Nammu stands on it forever, in the act of approach. The seated god faces him with the horned crown of divinity, the rod and ring extended outward, not casually, but as signs of authorized order. Between them is the entire subject of this investigation. A threshold, not just a carved scene, a statement about how the world was believed to work. The king is powerful, but he is not self-authorizing. He is chosen, commissioned, and instructed. He may build the structure, but the image itself implies that the sacred center remains governed by something greater than royal will. That one carved moment, once you have seen the records surrounding it, becomes almost impossibly dense. The ziggurat is no longer just a monument. The temple is no longer just an ancient religious complex. The stairways, the walls, the purification rooms, the courts, the inner chambers, the priestly offices, the law codes, the hymns, the flood traditions, all of them gather around that one idea. Approach requires designation, and the surviving evidence has shown us piece by piece how seriously that principle was maintained. The architecture said it. The temple plan narrowed movement. The precinct walls enclosed sacred territory. The stairways converged into controlled ascent. The lustration rooms required bodily preparation. The nested chambers reduced human access step by step. The innermost room was reached only after the outer world had fallen away. The administrative records said it. Temple personnel were differentiated by function and by spatial access. Not all who served could go where the center of service was. Public ritual and inner ritual were not the same thing. Outer offices and inner offices were not interchangeable. The legal world said it. The king's legitimacy was tied to divine commission. Temple order and civic order were expressions of the same structure. Violation of sacred boundaries was not merely disobedience, but disruption. The literary text said it. The king list framed post-flood civilization as restoration of an older, divine order. Inanna and Enki presented the ME as transferable patterns of civilization, not human inventions. The descent of Inanna mapped passage inward as stripping and testing. The Gudea cylinders showed sacred building as divine instruction, not personal ambition. The flood traditions implied that what survived catastrophe had to be correctly carried forward, and the personal witness of Enheduana said it more intimately than anyone else. She lived inside the sacred system. She knew the difference between standing within it and being cast out of it. She described the temple as a place whose threshold excluded the unqualified. She wrote as someone for whom sacred access was not abstract symbolism, but lived reality. When you place all of this together, the pattern is simply too strong to ignore. The records are not random. They are mutually reinforcing. They come from different cities, different centuries, different political conditions, and still they point to the same conclusion. The inner chambers of the Sumerian sacred world were restricted to designated persons, and among the highest forms of access, that designation was bound up with lineage in a way the civilization understood as necessary. This does not solve every mystery. It does not tell us exactly what the Sumerians thought lineage carried. It does not settle whether the language of divine designation should be read politically, spiritually, symbolically, or more literally. It does not allow archaeology to prove the presence of Milam in the way one can prove the slope of a brick wall. But it does leave us with certain things firmly in hand. The restriction was real. The architecture was built to enforce it. The law and administration supported it. The literary imagination assumed it. The sacred worldview required it. And the people who lived nearest to it seemed to have experienced it as something deeper than social hierarchy alone. That finally may be the most honest conclusion available. Not that the Sumerians have handed us a neat answer, but that they preserved a coherent problem. They ask us to imagine a world in which reality is not flat, a world in which some places are more charged than others, a world in which office is not merely assigned, but born, a world in which descent is not only biological, but transmissive, a world in which the deepest thresholds do not respond to ambition, but to fitness. Whether you accept that world literally is not the point. The point is that they built it, they wrote it, they maintained it. And they left enough of it behind for us to recognize the pattern, even if we cannot fully recover the experience. That is why the stone in Philadelphia still matters, because it is not just a surviving artifact. It is a surviving argument. A king stands before a god. The god extends the signs of ordered authority. The king receives but does not erase the distance between human power and sacred center. That distance is the subject. That distance is what the whole Ziggurat system organized. That distance is what law, ritual, lineage, and architecture were designed to mediate without abolishing. And once you understand that the broken stone becomes strangely complete, even in fragments, its message survives the damage, its world survives the burial, its threshold survives the collapse of the city that raised it, which is perhaps the most beautiful thing about the whole record. So much of ancient life disappears, voices vanish, buildings fall, languages go silent, but sometimes the structure of a thought endures. And here what endures is the thought that there are doors not everyone can cross, not because exclusion is good in itself, but because some forms of nearness require transformation, qualification, or recognition before they can be born. The Sumerians did not leave us a final explanation of that thought. They left us the thought itself, still standing, still asking. And after 4,000 years, that may be enough. What the dust still holds is not certainty. It holds continuity. It holds the pressure of a question preserved longer than almost any human institution survives. For 4,000 years, the clay tablets waited in the ground. The bricks of held their shape. The rebuilt foundations of Eridu remained stacked one above another. The names of kings and priestesses stayed pressed into fired surfaces. Enheduana's words endured in copied tablets, long after her own city changed hands, long after her language stopped being spoken in everyday life, long after the rituals she knew had fallen silent. And still, when we gather the evidence together, the same pattern appears. The inner chambers were real. The restrictions were real. The qualifications were real. The people who built, served, legislated, and wrote within this civilization treated those facts not as poetic decoration, but as structure. That is what makes this whole subject so compelling. Not because it proves something sensational, not because it confirms a modern fantasy, not because it lets us turn Mesopotamia into a mystery cult for entertainment, but because it shows us an ancient civilization thinking with extraordinary seriousness about one of the oldest human questions: what qualifies a person to stand near ultimate power, ultimate presence, ultimate reality. Their answer was not democratic, it was not modern, it was not easy, and it was not casual. Their answer was that access had to be earned, inherited, confirmed, purified, and born, not in every sphere of life, not for every person, but at the center, where the visible world touched the invisible order, yes. There they believed all of those things mattered. The wrong person in the wrong room was not merely inconvenient, it was dangerous. The right person in the right room was not merely prestigious, it was necessary. And perhaps that is why the records still feel strangely unsettling. Because even now, after all our archaeology, our translations, our debates, our distance from their cosmology, the basic shape of their thought is not entirely alien. We still know what it means for some rooms to matter more than others. We still know what it means to approach certain thresholds with preparation rather than casual confidence. We still know the difference between public identity and private worth. We still recognize, at least instinctively, that not every kind of nearness can be handled by every kind of self. The Sumerians expressed those intuitions through temples, priesthoods, dynasties, sacred washing, divine radiance, and the language of the Me. They built entire cities around the belief that order had to be maintained from the center outward. They believed that civilization was not self-sustaining, that it required alignment with patterns deeper than human preference, and that some people were specifically designated to bear that burden. We are free to disagree with them. We are free to interpret them symbolically. We are free to see politics in their sacred order or spirituality in their politics, or both at once. But what we are not free to do after reading the records carefully is pretend they were vague. They were not vague. They were exact. They named the offices. They arranged the rooms. They marked the thresholds. They listed the personnel. They wrote the hymns. They recorded the restorations. They preserved the architecture of approach in both stone and story. And they left behind enough for us to see that the center of their world was built around a disciplined distinction between outer participation and inner access. That is the final gift of the evidence. It does not solve the mystery for us. It teaches us how carefully the mystery was held. In that sense, the tablets are doing the same thing now that the temples once did. They do not throw open the inner room. They do not hand us a neat conclusion. They bring us to the threshold, let us see the pattern, and then stop. The final crossing is left unresolved. Maybe that is fitting. Maybe that is the only honest ending. Because this investigation was never really about proving that the Sumerians were right in every theological detail. It was about listening to what they actually said and allowing the weight of that testimony to remain intact. And what they said again and again was that civilization rests on transmitted order, that sacred space is graded, that access is not casual, and that the deepest thresholds recognize something more than rank. That idea has survived empires. It survived the collapse of cities. It survived burial under desert soil. It survived the death of a language. It survived the destruction of temples. It survived the smashing of monuments. It survived because clay remembers. And tonight, wherever you are, you have listened long enough to feel the outline of what those people were trying to preserve. Not an answer, an outline, a structure, a quiet insistence that some truths are approached in stages, that some rooms are entered only after stripping away what is unnecessary, that some forms of reality do not respond to display, but to what remains when display is gone. The dust of Ur still holds the marks of Ur-Nammu's builders. The tablets still hold the stylus impressions of scribes who believed they were preserving the order of the world. The hymns still hold the voice of Enheduana, who knew from inside experience what it meant to lose the center and return to it. And the broken stone in Philadelphia still holds the image of a king at the threshold, receiving authority but not abolishing the distance between human and divine. That distance is where the whole story lives. It is where the ziggurat rises. It is where the gates narrow. It is where the priestess waits. It is where the law becomes sacred, and the sacred becomes administrative, and the administrative becomes cosmic. It is where a civilization placed its most serious attention, and now it rests with you, not as a doctrine you are required to believe, not as a mystery you are required to solve, but as a question you are now equipped to carry. What does a threshold recognize? The Sumerians answered in their own language, the me, the ordinance, the designation, the lineage, the purified bearer, the one fitted to stand where others could not. We may answer differently, but after hearing them on their own terms, we cannot say they did not think carefully. They thought carefully enough to build mountains of brick for the sky, carefully enough to bury hymns in clay, carefully enough to preserve names, offices, and sequences of approach for thousands of years, carefully enough that even now, in a world unimaginably distant from theirs, their silence still feels deliberate. The tablets have waited a very long time. They can wait longer, and perhaps that is the right final image to leave with. Not a revelation, not a grand conclusion, just the river plain in the dark, the ziggurat rising above it, the courts within the walls, the inner room beyond the last doorway, and somewhere in that silence, a civilization still holding its breath around the threshold.